You remember collecting rocks as a child? Something about finding that one special rock or pebble among the many, many rocks and pebbles brought so much excitement to the young hearts of my siblings and myself. Some rocks were small. Others were large stones that we still keep to this day as door stoppers. Regardless of the size, the thought that a specific rock had been around for perhaps hundreds of years and possibly passed through the hands of countless rock collectors or admirers made you feel like you'd found a hidden treasure. And that's kind of how finding a historical knitting pattern feels. As I've learned more about the history of knitting and my own family heritage these past couple of years, I've kind of become obsessed with vintage and historical patterns, so often I find myself browsing through old pattern books on Internet Archive, particularly The Art of Knitting by Butterworth Publishing from 1892, as it's one of the few historical pattern books with pictures. This time, a particular pattern caught my eye, the gentleman's football sweater. These football sweaters were naturally worn by gentlemen at the time as a type of sports sweater and were wisely designed as garments that were not only warm but also sturdy to hold up to wear and tear while also being flexible, giving the garment movement and breathability. While I'm personally not into sports, the construction of the sweater greatly intrigued me, as you'll see in a few minutes, and the fact that the instructions seemed fairly easy to follow and I had a picture as a guide made me want to give it a try. First things first though, I needed to interpret what yarn and needles to use because the originals are, dare I use the pun, history. Upon a little internet digging, I discovered a knitting book from the early 1900s with images of what bone, wooden, steel, and celluloid knitting needles and crochet hooks all would have looked like size-wise, which is helpful since the dates of both pattern books are pretty close and I don't think sizes would have changed that quickly. However, I obviously wouldn't be able to hold up a knitting needle to the screen or a piece of paper if I printed it off because I'm not quite sure what exactly are the dimensions of the original book's publication. So after a little more digging, I came across two very helpful websites that had charts of modern needle conversions as well as modern yarn weight conversions. Overall, the closest interpretation I could get was that the yarn is what we would consider today to be a worsted weight or number 4, and the needles for the body would be anything between a 4 and 4.5 millimeter, and the cuffs roughly a 2.75 or 3 millimeter needle, which makes sense also since the gauge of the sweater seems pretty large at 3 stitches per inch. And no, this pattern absolutely does not have a gauge, as apparently that wasn't a thing back then. So to figure out the gauge, I took the number of stitches that the pattern said to cast on, which was 96, and divided that number by 36, which was the total number of inches the sweater would be in width, and got this fancy number, which I rounded to 3 for the sake of my sanity. The original pattern only has one size, so I knew I would have to do the math to come up with my own, which is actually kind of simple since I calculated the gauge already at 3 stitches per inch. I want mine to be oversized, so I took a sweater I already owned that I liked the fit of to determine how wide I would need my sweater to be. The pattern says to knit in a 1x1 rib, but because I do not want to knit rows upon rows of ribbing flat, I decided to do a half fisherman's rib instead. This is the first gauge swatch I made using the recommended needles and yarn, but I didn't like the color or the thickness of it. So I ended up switching to a DK weight yarn in black, and while I know it's harder to show this color on camera, I don't have a completely black sweater and thought it'd be a good addition to my wardrobe. Here I have a swatch using 2 different needle sizes, and I went with the larger needle because I like the way it looks. So I got a little carried away with the excitement of this project and didn't film knitting the bottom band, which is this part here. But what I did was cast on 116 stitches, as that's the number I needed with my gauge to get my desired width, and I knit the basket weave stitch, which is knit 2, purl 2 for 2 rows, and then purl 2, knit 2 for the next 2 rows. This creates a very sturdy band like the pattern says, which is good for an active wear garment. However, I also noticed that it still has a lot of nice drape, and I think this construction is just genius because it's still kind of like a traditional rib pattern, but has just a little more structure without having those weird gaps between the knit and purl stitches you sometimes get. So honestly, I think I'm going to be incorporating this method of a rib button band in my modern knitting garments more often. I also want to point out that by using the long tail cast on method, I got this almost slipped stitch effect with the ribbing, which helped it stretch a bit more. And I know it's probably hard to see because it's black, and I'm sorry about some parts in this video that may not be that easy to see because of the dark color of the yarn. Also, let me show you real quick a quick tip I learned that is very helpful for beginners on how to decide how much yarn you'll need for a long tail cast on, because I had to cast on 116 stitches and there's no way I would have kept guessing how much of a tail I should use so I wouldn't have too much or not enough yarn for the cast on. So what you do before you cast on is wrap the yarn around your needle 10 times, and obviously I'm showing you this after the fact. Pinch the yarn at the last wrap and then slide it off the needle. So now you know the length of yarn it takes to make 10 stitches. With that in mind, you'll measure out in multiples of 10 lengths of yarn. So 10, 20, 30, etc. You'll do that until you have the number you need, and you can cast on with the right amount of yarn from the get-go.
A hard bishopric for a good bishop. The bishop did not omit his pastoral visits because he had converted his carriage into alms. The diocese of Digny is a fatiguing one. There are very few plains and a great many mountains, hardly any roads, as we have just seen.
And so I set out knitting row upon row of half fisherman rib. Now I decided to not make my sweater as long as the original pattern says. As you saw in the images, these football sweaters were designed to be roughly thigh length, and that is personally not a style I like for myself, so you can see me here measuring my fabric against the sweater I'm using for my dimensions to see how much further I need to knit for the shoulders. This sweater doesn't, by the way, have any armhole shaping whatsoever. It's just a flat rectangle, so it's a great project for those new to Victorian patterns as it's not complicated. I also want to say that if you're new to historical pattern recreations and you want to stay faithful to the original designs, don't worry if you want or need to make adjustments to the pattern to fit your own body type or personal style taste, as I'm doing. That's actually completely historically accurate. In ye olden times, if you will, you were expected to make garments that fit you exactly, and that's what made historical knitting, crochet, and sewing so unique and custom fit. That's also why the instructions for historical patterns are considered vague compared to those of today, because they are written mainly as what they called recipes. They give you the basic steps, or ingredients, if you will, to make the garment, and leave the customization up to you. Once I knit a certain length, I held the rectangle up to me to see if I wanted to shorten or lengthen it. and these stitch markers you see help me keep track of my rows. Every 10 rows I place a stitch marker, which makes it easier for me to total them up later so I can knit the back portion the exact same length. I highly recommend using stitch markers to help keep track because it makes the counting process much simpler. Then it was time to divide the stitches for the neck and shoulders. What's unique about this sweater design that I haven't seen in historical patterns before is that while worked flat, the front and back pieces of the sweater are actually knit in one piece, making the seaming process at the end much quicker. So what you're going to do is, starting on the right side of your work, divide your stitches roughly into thirds, using a third for each section. So there'll be a third for the right shoulder, a third for the neck, and a third for the left shoulder. You'll knit the first third stitches for the right shoulder, and then bind off the third of the stitches you made for the neck. And finally knit the remaining third for the left shoulder. Then you'll only work the left shoulder stitches for however deep you're going to want your neckline to be. The original pattern only calls for 4 rows because it's supposed to be a turtleneck in the end, but I personally don't like turtlenecks, so I knit only 14 rows for my shoulder. When you finish the left shoulder, cut the yarn, leaving those stitches on hold, and rejoin to the right shoulder and knit it the same length as your left shoulder. When you've knit the length for your right shoulder, you'll turn your work with the right side facing you, knit across those stitches, and then cast on the number of stitches you bound off for the neck and knit across the stitches that you put on hold. All of your stitches will now be back on your needle, and you can continue knitting the second portion of the sweater, so you'll knit for however many rows you did for the first side. When I had finished knitting the back and front portions of the sweater, I followed the pattern instructions and placed a stitch marker on either side of the sweater to mark where I wanted the armholes to be, and then I seamed up the sides of the sweater below the armholes with a crocheted slip stitch. Then using a pair of circular needles that were the same size as those I knit the body of the sweater with, so 3.75 millimeter, I picked up for sleeves. The original pattern has you pick up sleeves with only 2 double pointed needles, so you'd have to seam up one side of the work, but because I wanted to avoid seaming as much as possible, and because I'm interpreting this to more modern knitting techniques, I knit in the round entirely. Eventually, I did switch to DPNs once the stitch count got smaller. And based on how I interpreted the pattern, it doesn't seem the number of stitches you pick up matters so long as you pick up evenly to avoid bunching up your sleeve or adding additional fabric. The original pattern has you decrease every 5 rows for a specific number of rounds, and then decrease every other round until you reach the wrist. But again, I'm altering this to fit my desired style, so I just decreased every 5 rounds throughout. Then I had only the neckband to finish, and for this I did detour from the original pattern yet again to fit my own taste. The original pattern has you actually knit the collar flat for the folded over turtleneck look in the basket weave stitch, and then sew that collar to the neckline. Again, I'm trying to avoid seaming and I don't like turtlenecks, so I just evenly picked up stitches around the neckline and I did a 2x2 rib for a more classic modern look. I really love how this sweater turned out. The half fisherman's rib makes it very squishy and cozy, and I'm glad I went with an oversized look because that just adds to its comfort level. Again, I'm just appreciating the genius of the structure because though I'm not really moving around that much and won't wear this while doing active sports, I can't see how it would stay up on you if you wanted to tuck it in or something while running. But it's also super lightweight and movable due to the ribbing throughout. And yes, I'm completely aware that this book was printed in the UK, so football for them is actually what Americans call soccer. But since I didn't get around to filming this part until the fall, you probably can tell by the footage I actually knit this sweater in the summer, I had to give a tip of the hat to my American heritage as it's currently football season here. I do actually have my translation of this pattern in modern knitting terms on my blog, so I will link that down below in the description for you if you would like to have a go at this pattern without having the headache of converting historical terminology to modern knitting terminology. But regardless of whether you use the original pattern or my translation, please definitely tag me on Instagram if you make this sweater because I would love to see what you came up with and any alterations you made. But let me know what you think of this sweater. I know I took a few creative liberties with this historical pattern, but again, I think it's a great way to not only follow the Victorian way of making garments to fit your style, but also a good way to modernize historical fashion. What do you think? Would you have made any changes? And if so, what would they be? Let me know in the comments, and also considering liking and subscribing and all the YouTube things, because next time we're going to dive into a crochet pattern from the 1930s, and a quick hint is actually how I styled my hair here. So if that sounds interesting to you, definitely stick around. But regardless, I appreciate you taking some time with me today because your time is valuable, and the fact that you decided to spend it with me is much appreciated. Until next time, I wish you many blessings and happy making.
Epic. Football season, mate.
Quite clever and actually really, whoa.
I'm gonna do that again, just in case. Football.
So honestly, I think I'm going to be incorporating this method of a red button band. Oh, it's not a button band.
So get one.
Tell me when are you doing it?
Yeah.
Okay, that's good enough then.
Okay.
The sweater.
See? Don't even let that come in.
Hit Weech. Whoa.
Alright, that's not really this last time. This is not really. There we go.
Mark!